Monday was a day off for most people, but not for Peter King. Football Morning in America, what you need to know on this Tuesday begins with some nuggets that he harvested from NFL Executive VP of Football Operations, Troy Vincent. There are votes coming up later this week on a couple of potential rules proposals that have not yet been voted on because the owners have not been able to get together, and they're still not getting together. It's a virtual meeting for these potential rule changes. And one of the big questions is, now that replay review for pass interference calls and non-calls is going away, what will they replace it with? Before we move on to what they replace it with, though, Troy Vincent, the Executive VP of Football Operations, acknowledged that last year's pass interference replay rule was a disaster. What we put in last year, those outcomes were not good for professional football. We failed. I'm first in line. I shared that with league officials. I failed as the leader of that department. What did we learn from that? We've got to do our due diligence. You can't rush and just shove something in there without knowing all the consequences. And we found that out last year, live and in action, publicly. We didn't do our due diligence last year, and we failed miserably. Let me tell you something. I appreciate the candor, but if I'm the commissioner, and I see that, I expect the last line of that quote to be, "I therefore resign from my job." I mean, certain screw-ups are big enough that when you say, hey, man, I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, and look, I got a lot of respect for Troy Vincent. Again, I respect the candor. But there's a line where your candor walks you right out the door.
Well, okay, yes, I get it. I more appreciate the candor and the truthfulness, though, than anything. And, it wasn't like this was Troy Vincent's, idea to make sure that this happened. I mean, this was thrusted down his throat, too, Mike, by the NFL, the fans, the media, everybody. So he tried to make it work as best as possible, and I understand he deserves some of the blame there because, yeah, of course, he's in charge of a lot of what's being done. But at the same time, this was a league-wide issue. This is not a Troy Vincent issue. This is across the board, and you know that I was against this from the get-go. I mean, I can remember a show with you, me, and Big Cat on here not long after the Super Bowl in which the Patriots beat the Rams, where we were going, I don't want to see this rule. At one time, we saw it in the history of our football where there was such a blundered call that it affected a big moment in the history of the sport. Yes, I get it, but it was the disaster last year, and he's truthful there. It was stunk. It ruined football games. There was a lot of bad calls. It ruined for some seasons for some teams and how they got off the, we saw just two plays right there. It affected teams losing games in that Texans game and of course, the New York Giants versus the Patriots.
Ruining seasons is a little bit strong, though.
Yeah, it might be strong. I agree. You're right.
Season was ruined. All right. You'll concede that point. And look, I didn't want this. I wanted Sky Judge. I thought something needed to be done, and Sky Judge is the fix. It continues to be the ideal fix. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's put this to bed first, Chris, because one thing that there is disagreement on, even within the competition committee, is whether this was a failure from the get-go, a failure of concept or a failure of execution. And you could argue this is never going to work because you are invading the inherently subjective decision-making that comes from determining what is and what isn't pass interference. Now, look, I believe that there are certain plays that are so clearly on the right side of the line where you say that's definitely pass interference. They should have dropped a flag. We have to drop a flag. The problem is you get closer to the line, where do you differentiate? And that's what they struggled with last year. So it was maybe part concept, part execution, because what did we witness all year long? The bar kept moving. We thought it was here. Then it moves down. Then it moves up. Then it moves down. And constantly I was hearing that Al Riveron, who has taken way too much blame for this, and there are still people who want to blame Al Riveron for it. You need to understand there are people above him that were telling him what to do and how to do it. This isn't just his call. And so when you have, in real time, the urgency of making the decisions, and your bosses are moving the bar on you all the time, and they're mad about whatever decision you make. You make the decision, they're mad at you. You're being too stringent. All right, you drop it. Oh, you're not being stringent enough. Then you move it, and it was a mess. So it was a combination of a bad concept and also poor execution because of the pressure and the misdirection that those above Al Riveron continued to place on him all year long.
Well, yeah, and I think that's exactly what Troy Vincent is talking about, the unforeseen consequences and those type of things. Everything rushed into judgment there with this conversation. And yeah, things were not well thought out. And so not well thought out to what you're saying, Mike. I mean, it went from okay, it's got to be so egregious, we'll never overturn it. And then it became okay, now we're going to call it to the letter of the law. And then all of a sudden it went back to it's got to be so egregious. That's the only way we're going to overturn it. And of course, it hurt some teams, and I know when I misspoke before, it's saying it messed up some seasons. Well, it certainly altered some games and that affected team seasons that way. But it was just a disaster altogether. First off, none of us, people like you and I and Tony Dungy and Rodney Harrison and Mike Tirico have been watching football our whole lives. Rodney Harrison, a borderline Hall of Famer, Tony Dungy in the Hall of Fame. I mean, we listen to them on a weekly basis argue about, was that pass interference? Was it not? We don't know what the hell they're going to call in New York. So it became a talking point, too, a negative talking point during the 100th anniversary of the NFL season. That's where it was just all bad, let alone if we're trying to get young viewers into this sport, we can't be having 10-minute delays to watch the referees huddle up and figure out whether it's pass interference and all that crap either. So I'm glad they're done with it.
The problem is that the shifting standard affects the integrity of the season. And we hear about that all the time in other contexts. And in this setting specifically, having a rule that was applied differently throughout the course of the season does affect the integrity of the 256 regular season games. The good news is by the time we got to the postseason, it seemed to be under control. There wasn't any major controversy in any of the 11 postseason games. But, Chris, look, even though it's hard to pinpoint how it may have affected someone's season, surely you take out that one play and you flip it. If it was called, if it wasn't called, if it should have been called, if it shouldn't have been called, it can affect a game. It can affect the outcome of one game, which can have a cascading effect on the rest of the season. That's why you want the same rule to be in place, the same standard to be in place. So with that dead, the question is, what will they replace it with? And there is momentum building for the Sky Judge concept, even though they don't apply that term. They call it the booth umpire or the senior technical advisor to the referee or something like that, the assistant to the regional manager, some complicated, convoluted term. There are concerns, though, about their ability to find 17 people who would be properly skilled and trained and suited to serve in that capacity. And this is how I'm always going to explain it, because I think this is critical for the NFL to have it. That person that bridges the gap between what the officials see on the field and what we see at home. Someone who knows the rules, someone who has experience on the field, and someone who can sit there and watch all the camera angles and help the folks on the field when they miss things, because they inevitably do. Troy Vincent says the concept of the eighth man in the booth has some merit, but we just don't have the pipeline of officials today. Can we get there? Yes, but today it could be a challenge. Terry McCauley, a former referee who would be a prime candidate for this gig. I think they can find 17 former referees who can do this if they really want to do it. And I'm rubbing my fingers together here, not to simulate cricket wings, but to say, pay the money and you'll find 17 people. Terry McCauley says finding 17 who have the skills to do the job, and then clearly defining which rules can be enforced and which rules can't be enforced is extremely problematic. Until there's a consensus on both of those issues, it would be difficult to imagine how this could be successfully implemented. I don't disagree with that. Step one, pay the people. If you have the money, if you show up, and having the money shows the motivation to do this, Chris. This is excuse-making. This is excuse-making at the highest level. I'm not blaming Terry for it. Terry's reflecting the mood that he is detecting from the people who are involved. They don't want to pay for it. So when you don't want to pay for it, you use excuses like, harumph, we're going to have a hard time building the pipeline. You're not going to have a hard time building the pipeline if you decide you're going to pay 7 figures for that job. I guarantee you that. And can you afford it? You damn can. So go get Terry McCauley, Gene Steratore, Mike Pereira, Dean Blandino, Ed Hockley, anybody who has retired from a referee job over the past 5 years. You got your 17. You pay them $1 million each, and you're good to go. Now, we don't pay that much to the referees. Well, look, that's your problem, because this is the most important function on field during the 256 regular season games. You maybe need to devote more money to these positions so guys don't jump to networks where they get more money for less pressure and less work and less scrutiny and less everything. More money and less everything is a good deal. So you have to compete with that. It's not hard to do. You got the money to do it. It's that simple, Chris. I'll shut up.
No, it is that simple. I mean, more money to the referees in general, just to where we have more referees that want to be, or more qualified people who want to be referees, to refresh that pipeline that Troy Vincent's talking about. That's the big issue too. I mean, you're right. I think a lot of people who used to flirt with the idea of, I want to be a ref, this day and age now with Twitter and social media, and whoa, I could have 17 great games and mess up one little call in the first quarter of a wild card playoff game, and people want to, kill that ref and murder him. I mean, it's really gotten that crucial to where I think a lot of these guys look at it and go, damn, what the hell? Well, for that pay, for what they're paying, I don't want to deal with all of that and the scrutiny and everything that goes along with it. So, really, it's probably a fundamental problem in just paying the referees more in general to get more people to want that job. And then you're right, Mike. I mean, at the end of the day, for the Sky Judge and all those things, yeah, the Gene Sterators, all of them, certainly you're going to have to pay a pretty penny to get them away from the networks. But also, yeah, anybody that's a retired referee that we think, okay, has gotten out of he doesn't want to move on the field anymore. He's out of that age. He can't do that stuff. Get him in the Sky Judge position. Anybody with experience can help in this situation.
Here's how I interpret the comments from Troy Vincent and the comments from Terry McAulay. What's going to happen this week is that they will adopt Sky Judge on an experimental basis for the preseason, if there is one. That's it. And until they can have a year or two of data from experimenting with Sky Judge in the preseason, the problem is it's going to be hard to do the right experiment if you don't have the best possible people in the job, right? If you got some schlub that doesn't know what he or she is doing, who is talking to the referee during the game and distracting and irritating the referee because this person doesn't understand the rules thoroughly enough, doesn't have the experience on the field, doesn't have the authority to speak to the referee and say, drop a flag, pick up a flag, move the ball, whatever, it's never going to work. See, the question is, do they want this to work? If they want it to work, they will direct the money to it, and they have the money to do it. They'll direct the funding to it, and they will get the best people. But I think they're trying to set this up as a preseason experiment. We've seen that before with potential rule changes. And if it ever gets passed, it'll be passed on a one-year basis, just like the replay review standard was, so that you would need 24 votes to renew it the next year, not 24 votes to kill it once it becomes a permanent rule change. But I think this is several years away from happening. And here's what will happen. Here's what I think they're going to try to do. They're going to try to kick the can with the old rules for a while to see if the outcry for something beyond the 7 officials on the field is mandated by whether it's people who are losing money on bad calls via legalized gambling, whether it's politicians, et cetera. So I think they may try to kick the can for a little bit until they realize we have no choice. We've got to spend the money to staff this position and use it.
Well, that's where I was going to ask you for, when does, legalized gambling come into the conversation here? I mean, again, it's going to be such a big part of the sport. We got a team in Las Vegas. There's going to be billions and billions of dollars into the league. This would be an investment I would think the league wants to make just to, soothe over consumers and bettors out there to make them feel good. Okay, the NFL is doing everything they can to make this game fair and officiated the right way. And they have the right protocols and people, in the Sky Judge position or whatever that may be. I would think that's a big part of it, and the NFL is going to have to balance that out over the next year or two.
Here's the reality. When the dust settles on the pandemic and states decide to try to rebuild the budgets that have been busted by what's happened, shrinking tax base, et cetera, increased costs, public services, the easy way for states to make back the money that they lost during the pandemic is to legalize two things, Chris. Legalize gambling and marijuana. And I think we're going to see both of them sweep the country. Anybody that was on the fence or against it, I know you're very happy to hear that.
Winning.
It's going to be, I think it's going to be legalized for recreational purposes in far more states than it currently is. And gambling will be legalized. The states that were reluctant to do it will embrace it because that is the easy way. You tax the hell out of the marijuana and the gambling, and you make back a lot of that money. But the thing is, as more and more people are wagering their hard-earned money on sports, the outcomes need to be more pure. The calls can't be egregiously bad, and the obligation will be on the NFL to make it right and to spend the money to make it right. It's easy to justify spending the money because they're going to make more money generally and specifically off of the proliferation of legalized gambling.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.